Hi, and welcome back to the Holocaust Healing Part 2. In Part 1, we talked about liberation of the camps and how many of the Allied soldiers were not aware of what they were actually looking at when they found some of these concentration camps. And we also talked about the role of the average German citizen, how some of them did know what was going on and others did not, which, it really depends on the situation. Many of them were anti-Semitic and were okay with what was happening, and others were just very much not in the know. They didn't understand what was happening to these Jews. They didn't see the death camps. They didn't see the gas chambers, and so they wouldn't have been aware of what was happening. In this part, we're going to continue to talk about sort of what happens next, specifically with what happened to the Nazis who were involved. We're going to talk about what happened to the Jews that survived, and we'll progress from there. So let's take a look here. So what was next for the Jews? Well, wives, husbands, sons, daughters, and all family members were gone in some cases. Finding survivors of your family was not easy. There were many people who survived, of course, who were missing all sorts of different members of their family. It was very common for people to be taken to Auschwitz, separated from their family, and have mother, father, or grandfather, grandmother taken right down to the gas chamber and never see them again. And obviously, you wouldn't even necessarily know that they were killed. You wouldn't see them for days, weeks, months at a time, and you could only assume the worst. So a lot of these survivors now had to figure out where their family was, if there was any family out there at all left for them. So just because the Holocaust was officially over didn't mean anti-Semitism was. There was still a lot of anti-Semitic people in Europe. Just because Hitler was dead, just because the war was over, did not mean people automatically loved the Jews. So it didn't necessarily mean that survivors were going to automatically be treated well and given all sorts of property back and things like that. So anti-Semitism was still very much alive in Europe. Property rights of stolen goods and homes were not honored. That's what these images show here. A lot of very valuable art was pilfered and taken by the Nazis, some of which has been given back today. Others have not been found. There's a lot of stolen art out there that belonged to Jews that may never ever be given back to the rightful heirs, at least. A lot of goods you saw in Schindler's List. You're talking gold and jewelry and all sorts of different pieces of furniture and just property in general was not given back. I mean, how could it be? It changed hands probably so many times, and people went back to their homes, and different people live there now. Very, very tragic for the survivors, of course. So very few got wealth or property back. Many of them were quite wealthy before relocation. And you saw this a little bit in Schindler's List. I mean, some of these Jews were doctors, they were lawyers, they were prominent members of society, and they had accumulated quite a bit of wealth that they never would see again if they were lucky enough to survive. So many Jews had nothing left for them in Europe, so they fled Europe. Big question is, where do you go? Well, if you know your Hebrew history, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the unit, you look at Palestine, which is where modern-day Israel is. It's really the promised land of the ancient Hebrew people. That's where a lot of their culture originated, so that's going to be one place for them to go. So the creation of Israel comes shortly after World War II and the Holocaust. So Israel is at the southeastern tip of the Mediterranean Sea, and as I mentioned, was the promised land of the ancient Hebrew people. So you have Egypt right here, and just northeast of that, you have Israel. And Israel, up until 1948, did not exist as an official state or country, but that's going to change here because Israel declared itself a nation in 1948. This has been a major source of conflict even to this day because many Palestinians in this region also have claim to that land, and Israel basically took it, and both sides have been fighting for the last, do the math, 65, 75 years here over this piece of property. But 42% of the world's Jewish population lives in Israel today. You're looking at roughly 14 to 16 million people in the whole world are Jewish. That's not a very big number. I mean, we have states in the United States that have more people than that. You can imagine with the 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust, they would have had children. Some of them would have had children or grandchildren by now. So the number of that 14 to 16 million would be much, much, much higher today had those Jews not been killed in the Holocaust. But one of the sanctuaries that existed for them was to move down here to Israel, and Israel is a predominantly Jewish country. It's the only predominantly Jewish country in the world today. Well, there was something called the Nuremberg Trials that followed here in Europe. Many camp leaders and Nazis were put on trial for crimes against humanity. Obviously, the rest of the world was going to take notice of this and try to bring those who were guilty of either orchestrating the Holocaust or carrying out actions during the Holocaust, trying to bring them to justice. So one of them, Rudolf Höss, and that's how you pronounce his name, it's not Haas, it's Höss. Rudolf Höss, who was the commandant of Auschwitz, was hanged after a quick 3-week trial. We haven't talked about him, but this just shows you that some of the Nazis who were involved definitely were found guilty and executed. Adolf Eichmann, who we spoke about in one of the previous lectures, he escaped to South America but was later snatched by an Israeli team, Israeli troops, 15 years later, and he was sentenced to death after a 4-month trial. Heinrich Himmler, who was the other one who we talked about with Eichmann, both Eichmann and Himmler were really kind of the architects of the Holocaust. Himmler committed suicide with the potassium cyanide capsule shortly after his arrest and before he would stand trial at Nuremberg. So he never gave, he didn't want to give people the satisfaction of being on trial and being executed, so he committed suicide in a very cowardly manner. Joseph Mengele, he was the angel of death, the doctor who did experiments on Jews in Auschwitz. He escaped to Argentina and died many years later under the name of Wolfgang Gerhard. So he never was captured and put on trial. And over 7,000 SS guards who worked at Auschwitz and survived, fewer than 800 were ever put on trial, and 90% of those involved were never prosecuted. Now you can imagine that across all of the concentration camp system. You're talking about very few people had to answer for their crimes during the Holocaust. And it's really sad. I mean, obviously you need evidence, you need documentation that they did terrible things, and sometimes that exists, sometimes it doesn't. But the main people involved, very few of them stood trial and were found guilty. Now, one of the weird things of the Holocaust is there are those out there who deny it ever happened. This definitely proves that anti-Semitism is still alive and well in the world today. So proof that anti-Semitism still exists, some deny the Holocaust ever happened. And this really is a really sad situation because the Holocaust is so well documented. The Nazis had such detailed records. Obviously, we have all the camps that are still there. I mean, you can visit Mauthausen, you can visit Auschwitz, you can visit Dachau, you can visit Pleshov, you can visit all of these camps. The ruins of them still exist. So the fact that people would say it didn't happen really proves that they don't like the Jews. So Holocaust deniers are often upset about Israel's independence and occupation of Palestinian lands. You look at the conflict that's going on in modern-day Israel today, the fact that Israel declared itself a country and angered a lot of Palestinians there has made people dislike the Jews even further today. So that's why some people don't want to give any legitimacy to what happened to the Jews because it just would mean finding sympathy with a group of people that they don't like. This guy who you see here, his name is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He used to be the leader of Iran as of, I believe it was 2013, maybe even 2014. Very interesting character. He was, for a while they're allegedly pursuing nuclear weapons for Iran, was a very open denier that the Holocaust ever happened. And that's scary because if he doesn't like the Jews, if he sympathizes with the Palestinians and he were to bring nuclear weapons to Iran, they could use those nuclear weapons then to attack Israel, which again is a predominantly Jewish country, and that could be a catalyst for World War III. Luckily, he's not in power anymore. He's no longer the leader of Iran, but sort of a scary idea that someone with anti-Semitism and potentially nuclear weapons could do some terrible things to the Jews even in the modern world today. What are the lessons for all of us today as we look at the Holocaust? Well, this proves that the power of a dictator is one that our country is strongly opposed to. Hitler's power gave him the opportunity to pull off something like the Holocaust. You couldn't do that in a democracy like the United States today. Obviously, people would be outraged. Congress would veto it. Their checks and balances would come into play, and the Holocaust would not be possible in the modern world. So democracy prevents such things. And I say hopefully because we saw, if you remember your American history, during World War II, we had Japanese that were put into internment camps. They certainly weren't death camps, but there were people who died in these camps. So the United States, has a little bit of a dark history with how we've treated ethnic groups as well. Of course, we know genocide did not die with the Holocaust. We know that because of Rwanda and Darfur. So Rwanda and Darfur in Africa have seen hundreds of thousands slaughtered at the hands of corrupt governments and rival tribes. So genocide can still very much happen in the modern world. The Holocaust is not that old. My grandfather was in the Holocaust. He was in Mauthausen, which is in Austria. But we see here in Rwanda that happened, the 800,000 Hutus were 800,000 Tutsis were killed by Hutus, and of course in Darfur you had over 300,000 to 400,000 people killed by the Janjaweed. Of course, studying the Holocaust teaches us the power of unity and the atrocities that can be brought on by hatred and xenophobia. Xenophobia is hatred of foreigners, hatred of other people. And so when we see that really start to boil over with a group of people who have power, there's no telling what they can do with it. Rwanda is a good example. The Hutus had machetes and they wanted to kill the Tutsis. They took the power and they started killing people. Nazis had the power in Europe and they took their guns and their systematic system of propaganda and concentration camps. And they started killing Jews. And that's all caused by hatred and xenophobia. If you ever get a chance to go to Washington, D.C., I highly recommend going to the Holocaust Museum. I've been there. It's been a few years now. Amazing experience. But the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. is a great place to see real artifacts, stories, and to honor those who suffered at the hands of the Nazis. There are multiple Holocaust museums across the country and the world. The Washington, D.C. one is one of the most famous ones, but definitely showing that we're trying to honor those who died and remember them and certainly remember what happened during the Holocaust. I have a slide here on student reactions it won't play on this particular video, so I apologize for that. If I can find the link to it, I will post that here and you can click and watch it. But here's our conclusion. I mean, this is the end here. We've taken a look at what happened to those involved. We've taken a look and see what happens to the Jews who survived. We've kind of talked about what happens after the Holocaust. And it's not a happy story, of course, but life had to go on for some of the survivors. And in most cases, they didn't have anything left. No family, no property, no homes. It's really a sad end to the Holocaust, which is obviously a very sad event in and of itself. So our conclusion here is the Holocaust is not ancient history. These events are still possible in our world, and if we take the time to understand how these events can unfold, then we have the power and the knowledge to stop them from happening. I mean, it's a very perfect reason why we study history. If we start seeing propaganda used to dehumanize another group of people, if we start seeing any type of situation in the world where one group of people is being separated and rights are being stripped, we can immediately use our lessons of the Holocaust to say, hey, wait a minute. We know what happens next. We know how this story ends, and we need to prevent that from ever happening again. So the Holocaust really is one of the most awful events that has ever happened, and hopefully we can prevent such things in the future. All right, let's take a look at our last constructive response question here. The question says, evaluate the efforts made after the Holocaust to help heal the memories of the Holocaust. And as mentioned earlier, there's no way you can heal the memories. I mean, it's such a tragic event. So many people lost family members and whole families. But ultimately, there are some things that are worth mentioning. For example, we've got the Nuremberg Trials. The Nuremberg Trials were set up to bring Nazi war criminals to justice, and some of them faced trial. But you saw the statistics. Most of the officers from Auschwitz never were prosecuted or never were put in jail. Several of the high-ranking members of the Nazi Party either committed suicide or fled, some of them to Argentina. So, it's great that these trials existed, but in the end, they did very little to actually prosecute those who were responsible. The creation of Israel is definitely worth mentioning, as Israel declares itself a nation in 1948. And that's not necessarily as a result of the Holocaust, but it gives Jewish people their own nation. And that certainly caused a lot of conflict since in the Middle East, but a lot of Jewish people from Europe fled Europe and went down to Israel, and then shortly after that, Israel declared itself a country. When you look at any other efforts that were made, there really isn't much. There isn't a lot that we can talk about. Certainly, things that we can say, here's what the Germans or the Nazis did for the survivors, because most people didn't get their houses back, they didn't get their property back, they didn't get their luxury items that they were stolen, taken back, or given back, assuming they survived. It was just an awful, awful event, and people had to pick themselves up and start their lives all over again. So there are efforts. They're not exactly the greatest efforts. I'm not saying people failed or did a poor job at trying to help out. It's just you can't fix the Holocaust. You just can't. And so the efforts made to heal things just kind of pale in comparison to the event itself. So that's going to do it for us, and that's going to wrap up our unit on the Holocaust. I hope you learned something. We'll see you next time.